morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I am Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds. And this week we're going to talk about a little bit different topic that many of us were probably thinking about throughout the 2021 growing season, and that was wildfire smoke. Obviously it created some very beautiful, pretty sunsets, which I'm thankful for. We get to see that's the good side of it. But how does it affect our crops? Is it impacting them yield-wise? Do we see a repercussion of that? Is this something as we move forward, in subsequent years, is it going to continue to be, an issue? And just understanding that element to how it impacts our crop. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit. Obviously, we saw it in many areas of Latham country, especially the northern parts in North Dakota and northern Minnesota. Even smelled it. I know even in Iowa here, we smelled it some nights. Like it was burning just down the road. And even on some of the data forward users up there in that area, I noticed some of the satellite images coming in from there. It looked very similar to clouds. So in my mind, if it looks like a cloud on a satellite image, obviously it's affecting the solar radiation coming down to the plants, the photosynthesis. So how does that all play a role into the yield at the end of the season with our crops? So we're going to dive into that topic a little bit this week and hopefully understand a little bit more how it affects our crops going forward and potentially in subsequent years down the road too if we see more wildfires. So the first thing is, what does it do? Well, first of all, it affects the intensity of the sunlight. That's the number one thing when I see it on a satellite image. Obviously, it's affecting that intensity, that sunlight that's coming down and beaming down when it's a beautiful, clear day and we have wildfire smoke intercepting that sunlight. Obviously, it's impacting the intensity of that sunlight. So, in 2020, they actually did a study out in California on this. And in a lot of areas, they noticed only about a 4% decrease in sunlight. Well, what does that mean? Obviously, it's going to vary. And we'll put up a picture as well from NASA on some of the wildfire smoke to kind of get an understanding. I know a lot of us saw this. We saw it on radars every day from the weather stations and so forth and where the intensity of the smoke was. But in those areas where it was really heavy, obviously it's decreasing the sunlight. It's decreasing the intensity of that solar radiation. In the areas where it's not as heavy or you see it just kind of wispy, looked like maybe a wispy cloud on the radar, and you didn't see as much dramatic impact as far as the sunlight coming down to the earth, it likely wasn't as much of an impact. So there's different degrees of this, and that's the challenge. It just depends on where that smoke is being held in the atmosphere and where it's really impacting different regions of the country and the Midwest. So that would be the first thing I'd keep in mind as you're thinking about this. The intensity of the solar radiation is one important factor that primarily can reduce yield in many cases. And if you do have those heavy areas where it's really blocking the sunlight, it's going to reduce photosynthesis in the plant. It's going to slow things down, especially when it comes to corn. Corn is more susceptible to this because it's a C4 plant. It's more efficient, I call it, than soybeans. So it does better with the radiation, does more photosynthesis. So it's going to be more impacted by slighter decreases in sunlight. So whether it's wildfire smoke or clouds or whatever, obviously it's going to be impacted to a greater degree than what soybeans would. The next thing is it actually diffuses the solar radiation. So it diffuses the sunlight. So as the sun comes down through the smoke, you can kind of think of it as little particles or mirrors kind of reflecting the light in different directions. And this can actually be good for crops, especially our corn in many cases, because it bounces the light. So it's bouncing the light in different directions. Instead of the solar radiation just coming straight down to the Earth's surface, it's bouncing it in different directions. So what does that mean? It gets into the crop canopy to a greater extent. So it's getting lower into the crop canopy. It's hitting some leaves that may not see as much, see more shading because of the leaves above them. When we have direct sunlight coming down, it hits those leaves and maybe misses the ones underneath it. But with the smoke and the haze, it's bouncing that sunlight, kind of redirecting it in different directions, and it can actually get lower into the crop canopy. And primarily in corn. When you have a very dense layer such as soybeans, that sunlight's still likely not going to penetrate down through there. So can be more efficient in terms of photosynthesis when it comes to this. If we're seeing leaves in the lower canopy intercepting more sunlight, they're doing better, getting more photosynthesis, more carbohydrates, ultimately more yield. When we talk about more photosynthesis, more dry matter, it's going to translate into yield. And the opposite is true. When we reduce the intensity of the sunlight and things like that, we're going to reduce the amount of carbohydrates, the sugars in the plant. We're going to reduce the dry matter, open that plant up to redirecting or remobilizing at the end of the season to make that yield. We see this a lot in terms of stalk cannibalization a lot of times with certain impacts from the environment or diseases. Corn is really good at that, remobilizing from the stalk. It's going to take it where it can and put it into the grain so it can fill that ear out. So that can be one case. We could see reduced plant health and things like that if we reduce that solar radiation, reducing photosynthesis overall. So number one, it reduces the intensity of sunlight, but on the flip side, it's kind of redirecting the sunlight to an extent, making it a different case of getting a little more sunlight into the canopy. So one good and one bad. The last one I want to talk about is also on the bad side. Unfortunately, it's increased ozone gas near the surface of the earth, and that's not good for plants. Plants can't use that ozone gas, and that comes from that smoke when it's closer to the surface, and that sunlight comes through that smoke and mixes, and basically the gases in the smoke create ozone gases, and those end up near the surface of the earth. That's not going to increase photosynthesis, although ozone gas is made up of oxygen molecules. It's not something that the plants can use. They need CO2, to get carbon into the plant and to push that photosynthesis, along. So not necessarily a good thing. I think in a lot of cases we didn't see a lot of this. I think if you want to really see a good picture of how this is probably this part is impacting crops, you'd have to look more out towards California, those areas where they were closer, where the wildfires were, and in a lot of cases they did see decreased yields, great impacts on crops such as grapes and high value crops and things that were closer to those wildfires. So that's not a good thing. We've got two good, one bad, two bad and one good. So you can see that there's a little bit of an offset here. But if we kind of just sum it up and think about it this way, I like to think about especially when I look at satellite images on our Data Forward app, if you see a cumulus cloud or those cumulonimbus clouds that turn into storm clouds, those cumulus clouds are really heavy. Obviously those have water molecules or ice crystals in them. They're very good at reflecting the sunlight, but they can also reflect it back down. We all understand how warming can happen with cloudy days, but it's also the opposite effect. It can cool it as well. It's shading the sunlight, bouncing it back up the opposite direction. So it has a little effect of both. It bounces sunlight up, bounces it down. But that's wobviously a little bit more intense. Those cumulus clouds are thick, and usually there's not very much sunlight getting through those clouds. So the wildfire smoke is a lot less than that. Obviously it's not impeding the sunlight, the intensity near that much, but in many cases, I know I talked to growers and Latham employees up there in the far north during the summer, and there was an impact from the sunlight and the solar radiation. So we know that it was impacting things, and if you're in those areas and you had multiple days of that intensity of cloudiness, then likely you did have some impact on your crop, probably the corn crop especially. So just to kind of reiterate, we don't necessarily know. There's no great easy way to categorize it. Hopefully you learned a little bit here during this video, but as anything in agronomy, there's always multiple aspects to it. So we had 3 different things we talked about, 2 bad and 1 good. So it really depends how much they offset each other, where you're at, where the wildfire smoke's at, and the intensity of it and things like that. So I'm sure going forward, if we have to deal with this in the future, we'll continue to learn and research how this really impacts our crops. But at least now you have a better idea what's going on with your crop out there, and more than just the pretty sunset. So Thanks for watching. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media platforms. And we look forward to seeing you next time.